Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Petra Alderman and I am the manager of the South Southeast Asia Centre at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I am also a researcher on the region. So on behalf of the Southeast Asia Centre, I would like to welcome you all today and also our three speakers to today's seminar. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Geeta Reddy, Dr. Megha Amrit and Manula Subrahma to a seminar titled Living with Coloniality and Precarity in Southeast Asia. So before we kick off the actual seminar, I would like to mention a few sort of housekeeping points about today's session. So as you might have noticed, we are also holding this as a hybrid session. So we have an audience online. The event is being recorded and we will be putting the recording of the event up on our YouTube channel where you can find recording of some of our previous events as well. So please do bear this in mind, that this will be eventually published and will be online forever and nevermore. If you would like to post about this event on social media, please feel free to do so. As I mentioned, apart from YouTube, we are also on LinkedIn and Instagram. Before I sort of introduce our three speakers, I also wanted to mention that there will be an opportunity for you to pose questions to our speakers after the presentation, and that also applies to our audience online as well. For the audience online, we will post an example of how to pose a question for our speakers, but please make sure that you use the Q&A function within Zoom. So not the chat function, but the Q&A function, so that we can bring up your question on the screen here in the room as well. We are also holding some more events throughout this term. Next week is the reading week, so we actually do not have any events, but then afterwards we are holding a screening on the Hun Sen regime in Cambodia. So it's a documentary film screening which will be happening on the 4th of March. So if some of you can join us either in person or online, you will be very welcome and we would be happy to see you there. And for the remaining events that we have prepared for this term and also the next term, you can check out our website. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers today. So we have Dr. Geeta Reddy, who is a senior lecturer in applied psychology at the Open University UK and principal investigator of the British Academy funded project ESCAPE URMI, which obviously we will be hearing more about today, which we are all very excited about. She is also a PI of the Open Societal Challenges funded BUSIM project. Dr. Geeta Reddy applies a transdisciplinary approach to understanding how people make sense of colonialism, multiculturalism, and migration in contemporary societies. Our next speaker is Dr. Megha Amrit, who is an Associate Professor of Globalization and Transnationalism at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University and a PI of the ARC consolidated grant Well Asia, the pursuit of wellness in Southeast Asia, new encounters and inequalities in an emerging industry. She's an anthropologist and interdisciplinary scholar and has published on themes around migrant labor, care, aging, inequalities, and well-being. And last but not least is Manula Subrahma, who's a poet and educator from Malaysia. She's currently employed as the project manager and storytelling lead on Dr. Geeta's project, and she is a SEAC graduate. So please welcome our three speakers today. To Geeta, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Petra. Thanks so much. How are you feeling today? Good? Great. It's lovely to see everyone together in this space to talk about some challenging issues, but hopefully thought-provoking and things that we can take along with us outside of this room as well. So I'm Geeta, as Petra wonderfully introduced me, and I'm the PI of the ESCAPE project. Today is an important day for us on the project for two reasons. One, of course, we get the opportunity to engage with all of you here in person to talk about coloniality and precarity, but it's also a day that we get to launch our decolonial methods toolkit. So it's a 109-page document putting together all the empirical studies that we have conducted over a period of 16 months They include very clear guidelines for us, and we hope that this toolkit will also be a resource for you. Let's move. Scroll down. So okay, got it. This one. Okay, you can just scroll up and down. Like that. Okay, yeah. Perfect. So this is the front cover of our Decolonial Methods Toolkit. And if perhaps I move this, you might be able to see an OSF link, but it's already on the Open Science framework. We'll give you a QR code at the end of this, so you can actually scan it and download it for free. And feel free to also use this in your own research projects. So as I mentioned, it's a 109-page document. It's a huge labor of decolonial love, of us putting together our thoughts and feelings and actions into a written format. And our fieldwork was split up into 3 different series. So we had a series focused on precarity, which we started off with. We went on then to coloniality. And then our last series is on training and policy mapping. So there were 3 fieldwork phases. Our precarity series was undergirded by this theoretical approach. We call it a 6-point precarity theoretical approach, adapted from a paper that I had written with some of my colleagues, one of whom was here, Dr. Claire Coultas from King's College. We took a systems-centered approach, a relational approach, an epistemology of precarity, focusing on collective agency, embodied affect, and differential effect. And the 2 research questions that guided us in the precarity series was, how do urban or resilient Malaysian Indian women understand, rationalize, and explain precarity and inequality in their everyday lives? And because we use a decolonial critical participatory action research, which is DCR that you see there, how can community-led support and initiatives mitigate the psychological and material effects of precarity in Malaysian Indian communities? So we had very clear 2 research questions applying a 6-point theoretical approach, which then allowed us to apply decolonial principles such as decolonial love, which we will talk about a little later, into action. And we met this collective of 47 Indian women in Kuala Lumpur and Penang over 5 days. Our next series is the Coloniality series. We looked at this research question: how do coloniality and modernity manifest among different generations of urban, poor, resilient Malaysian Indian women? Of course, underpinned by the coloniality matrix, looking at coloniality of being, coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of gender, and coloniality of nature. Of course, it doesn't make sense to look at each aspect of coloniality on its own. They're all interconnected and locked oppressions. But we decided to ensure that each aspect of our research project was looking at each of these principles. And then the last series was our training and policy mapping series. The research question that we were interested in is, how may differences in precarity experience amongst urban poor Malaysian Indian women help us to understand the affordances and the limitations of current policy initiatives directed at addressing intergenerational poverty transmission. So you may be interested, if not already, why were we looking at Malaysian Indian women? So Malaysia has a classification system where they categorize people according to their socioeconomic status, and this actually applies to their policy initiatives as well. We were focused on looking at the B40, so the bottom 40% of the socioeconomic status in Malaysia, and Malaysian Indians are overrepresented in this category. So we decided to focus, taking a gender transformative perspective, looking at Malaysian Indian women who, of course, experience the multiple axes of oppression if we look at intersectionality. So these are some of the decolonial principles that we applied to each and every project and each and every day and each and every activity. So each of these principles were applied at least once, but multiple applications can be found throughout the entire manual. So when we think about co-constructing knowledge, it's not just something that is an abstract idea, but something that we apply in person when we are discussing with the collective. This is our analysis. Does this resonate with you? Is there something that we missed out? How can we then ameliorate our understanding of this issue? So it was very much an interactive, playful, and transformative process where we met with our collective over 15 days of fieldwork over 16 months. And each day that we met our collective, the collective were given an equivalent of £40 a day. So we saw them as co-researchers who were coming in to share their expertise with us, and we recognized that labor and time and energy. Of course, we also arranged for transportation from their homes into the venue. We arranged for meals for them, and we asked them if they needed any childcare facilities as well. So the entire project was rooted in a variety of decolonial principles, and we applied that not just at the abstract understanding of theory, but also how it manifests every day. This is just a sample of what it looks like. So we have day 4 here, talking about the theme of the day 4 was co-producing the concept of precarity. We had learning outcomes for this day. We talked about the content. We looked at thematically. We were deciding between photo voice presentations and looking at the resonances and commonalities in all of the data that the co-researchers had collected. And something like the photo voice presentations will also have its own intended learning outcomes. We look at the decolonial principle, which is guiding this activity. For us here with sovereignty, we inform ourselves and also others, what do you need to actually conduct this study, this practice in your own research project. So you need a projector and a screen for the photos, you need a microphone, you need a recording device to actually collect the focus group discussions. We give an overview of the activity, and we actually tell you how we conducted the analysis. So here we took this, because we use photo voice, there's a specific photo voice analysis technique called SHOW. And you ask these questions: what do you see here? What is really happening here? How does this relate to our lives? Why does this condition exist? What can we do about it? This was created by Nicholas Melherb and colleagues based at the University of South Africa. And of course, all of this could not have come together without my amazing research team. So we have Kevin Buthman at the end, who is the digital communications lead, Dr. Pavitra Devi Silva, and Leah Gomez, who were field assistants, Dr. Nitya Gunasegaran is our co-investigator, Hannah Abi Hanam, who is our research associate, and we have Invanila Sugmar, who's here, who is our project manager extraordinaire. And why we are so passionate about this is that this project brings to life the seeds that we had sowed when we were thinking about how do we engage with the community in this generative form that is also transformative for us as the researchers, but also for the collective. So we didn't see ourselves as separate to the collective, and putting this into practice is extremely challenging, because we come into this space and I say, I'm Dr. Geeta Reddy, I'm here from the UK, how are we going to work together? And they already see you and call you in that form. So how do you then build this trust with them who are already cautious? Because you're going into a space where you have folks who have been questioned nonstop in their everyday lives. They are being asked, why are you poor? Why don't you just pull up your socks and get on with it? They have to go into police stations or government organizations and continue talking about their poverty so that they may get some aid or get some support. So a traditional interview technique doesn't necessarily work because it brings them into this different kind of space and it does not level the playing field. And so knowing this about the context and coming into this space, knowing that you want to do something different is the first step. But then how do you enact that? And so you have to go into this space thinking that you are going to keep fine tweaking. You're going to keep negotiating these things with your collective. And so we hope that what we have offered today with the Decolonial Methods Toolkit is a sort of resource to guide researchers who are curious and who are critical and who want to go into this space thinking and being open to the transformation that can take place. And so I urge all of you to download it from OSF. Without further ado, I think I will get on with our panel discussion, where we're going to draw from our project and give you some concrete examples of how we tackled some of these issues over the period of time that we were conducting our fieldwork. So thank you for that. I'm having a bit of a sore throat. So the three of us had been talking about how we were negotiating and thinking about these two concepts of coloniality and precarity. They are quite abstract concepts if we are familiar with them in our own work. How do they manifest in the research practice and the research process? So the first thing we were thinking about is how do we actually contest with or contend with agency in our methodological approaches. So we can start with Megha. Actually, Megha,
should I
do
a brief?
Okay. A brief introduction about your project.
Yeah. So nice to see everybody here, and thank you to Geeta and Inba for inviting me to join the conversation. So I'm not part of the project, but I'm someone who's worked a lot on these similar kinds of ideas around precarity and coloniality and labor in Southeast Asia. And so they kindly invited me to join this conversation so we could think together about these things. But I'm just going to say a few very brief words about the project that I will be speaking about so that there's a bit of context for my comments in the discussion. So I led a project at the Max Planck Institute for the study of religious and ethnic diversity in Göttingen. From 2017 until 2024, called Aging in a Time of Mobility. And we were essentially looking at the relationships between aging and migration in different areas of Asia, Africa, and South America. And we had two projects in Southeast Asia. So my colleague Victoria Sakti was looking at aging and displacement among refugees from Timor-Leste living in Indonesia in these borderland areas. And my project was on aging migrant domestic workers in Singapore and partly in Hong Kong. And most of the migrant domestic workers come from the region, from South and Southeast Asia, so primarily the Philippines and Indonesia, but also India and Sri Lanka, to work in Singapore as domestic workers. And I was specifically looking at this generation of domestic workers who were, approaching later life or older age. And so essentially they had moved to Singapore to work in the 70s, 80s, perhaps even early 90s. And they've been working abroad on temporary contracts for decades. We're constantly renewing these very restrictive contracts. But because there are no pathways to permanent residence or citizenship, they have to return to their countries of origin at the point of retirement. So in Singapore, that's when they turn 60, more or less. Sometimes they extend it a little bit. And I was interested in questions of precarity over the life course. So really looking at how financial and emotional insecurities associated with retirement and older age surface for these women. As they anticipate retirement and return migration, these forms of precarity are financial. They're thinking about future livelihoods, but there are also emotional insecurities around kinship care in older age and reconnecting with their families after decades of having lived apart from them. But I was also interested in making this, telling a story that was more complex than only precarity and looking at aspirations among migrant women, particularly as they emerged in midlife and as they were approaching retirement, became this quite generative space for looking at the forms of agency that were also emerging among women in these situations. And I think we'll talk a bit more about that now in our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Megha. So the first question that we had trying to link methodology and agency together was, what are the ways we have facilitated agentic expressions through the methodological approach that we have taken? Megha, you start first and then Inba, you can.
Okay, so methodologically, I didn't have, this decolonial methods kit is wonderful, the kinds of the resources that you have and the very sort of participatory, co-construction of knowledge that you foster through these activities. I went for a more traditional, if you want, ethnographic approach, although not so traditional because it was interrupted by COVID, and it ended up being more patchworky than we would have liked. But it was about building relationships with women from, over 5 to 6 years, making repeated visits to the field, and following up with, what has changed in people's lives. And I think that's important because there's a lot of research on migrant domestic workers, as many of you probably know. And it's almost a field that is quite saturated of, research in this area. And that also comes to practice as well. When you go into, you contact NGOs who are working with domestic workers, and they're very used to people, students, or, scholars of different stages of their career coming in. Also people doing, surveys, but a lot of people doing this very in and out, quite extractive research. And so I think the way to sort of bring out the agency among migrant women was really to foster those relationships over time, and to allow women to narrate their stories in a way on their own terms, because very often they are represented in ways which are quite reductive by, public and policy discourse. And so it was really about building this picture of complexity and understanding the layers of experience, the contradictions in their lives as well, anxieties, joys as well, which we'll come to in a bit.
But I think the ethnography is a beautiful method in that sense to build this trust over a period of time. So it does, you may say that it's not a decolonial approach, but then because you are working over a period of time, the collective or the participants in your case get to understand how serious you are with engaging with the topics at hand. And you're not sort of like, just coming in, asking an interview and then going off. And
I think it shares a lot of the sort of those principles that you talked about.
Like building trust must be so important.
And sort of that co-construction of knowledge, but which comes out in a different way, perhaps in ethnography, than through a more intentional sort of workshop format.
Thanks, Megha. What would you like to talk about?
So in Escape Urmi, other than photo voice method, we also used storytelling method. And this was particularly important. Dr. Geeta has mentioned this about the systemic and bureaucratic violence that the Malaysian Indian community face, be it in, we're talking about overrepresentation of death in custody with a lack of police accountability, but we're also talking about bureaucratic systems like banking, education, healthcare, legal sector. This is particularly difficult for women from the B40 community, which we talked about earlier. It's a government designated category for below 40%, below 40%, poverty line. Among our collective, we had illiterate elderly community members as well. So to ask, to conduct an interview or to surveys, traditional qualitative methods will not be relevant, or will not even be, it wouldn't be a kind method that fits the context of the community. So storytelling in that sense works because one, there is a long existing Tamil oral tradition. So it is something that comes naturally and instinctively to the community, but it's also that they define their own complex lived experiences in their own terms. And in a way, it is a reciprocal and relational method. So the core research team also will have to share a little bit about themselves. Particularly, we talked about bell hooks, where she mentioned how you cannot extract information from others by putting them in a position of risk and vulnerability when you are unwilling to share things about yourself. So storytelling method in that sense facilitated that reciprocal relationship. So every activity that we designed, we will model some of the stories that we tell before we invite the collective into the conversation. And also when they are telling stories, they select what they want to say, and they might omit certain things, and that is within their agency and their control in the research. So it becomes less of an extractive. We don't want to replicate an extractive practice where we ask questions and you answer, and you go back home and you're like, they know so much about me, I know nothing about them or the work. So storytelling in that sense facilitated agency in the community.
Wonderful, thank you. I think another thing which you did was to create a way that was easier for them to connect with us. So if they, couldn't work their phones, you would, get them aside and ask them, would you like to put a voice note into this phone right now, and supported them in using the tech that we were using as well. Mm-hmm. So that also helped to build trust, to know that, you're in safe hands. Mm-hmm. And that only happens when you are there speaking with them in person and you have worked with them over a period of time. The other axis of conversation, or one of the other factors that we were thinking of, was generative ambivalence. Is this something that you all have heard of, that you work with, generative ambivalence? Just to have a show of hands of folks in the room. Would you indulge me in giving you a little bit of a conversation about this? So I learned about generative ambivalence from Professor Akubo Emejulu, who is currently based at the University of Sheffield. And she had written about Black fugitive feminism and fugitive feminism among women of color activists in Europe. And this idea of generative ambivalence comes from what she calls as a misfeeling or as a refusal. And there's so much within activism where you are asked to experience joy or to think about joy because you are thinking, or activism is premised on this idea of a hopeful future. And therefore you are working towards this hopeful future. But on the other hand, you are exhausted and you are burnt out by the very structures that you are fighting each and every day. And so you are torn between these two almost opposing emotions that need to exist. You have to have that exhaustion to have this joy. The joy doesn't exist without exhaustion. And ambivalence gives you this sort of liminality, a space, a threshold within which to exist. And then it gives you some freedom around pause and thinking what you want to do next. And that space can be a very generative space to operate from. And so this was something that we were thinking about when we looked at our projects. How does our theoretical approach to this work and to understanding, aging amongst migrant workers in Singapore, and also intergenerational poverty transmission in Malaysia, how does generative ambivalence factor into this space, Megha?
Yeah. I find it a very generative concept to think with. Yeah. While I wasn't using it directly in my work, it resonates a lot with a lot of the stories and experiences that I encountered. And so I think about sort of the women approaching retirement. Many of them are middle-aged or late middle-aged, so they're in this kind of midlife space. And living in this space of uncertainty about the future. So there was always the sense that they left home to, as migrant women, to give their families a better future. So there was always these promises of social mobility through migration. And in fact, many do achieve, tick those boxes. They do buy a house or buy land. They do manage to educate their children. So, on paper, or, it seems as if the markers of having achieved that, are all met. But women find that they are then left with little for themselves, and haven't really had that time to really focus on themselves either. And it could be told as a very sad story that women work abroad from their families for many years and go back with hardly anything else. Yeah. But I think that reading is also, again, too restrictive. And I think there's a lot that happens in this space of precarity, of working abroad for many years, and anticipating the future, which is about building their homes despite these conditions of restriction. Mm-hmm. So building these multiple belongings, not only to their countries of origin or to their kin back home, but to even employers, families, the children they've taken care of, the older people they are caring for, many of the friendships they develop with other domestic workers, and the kinds of solidarities. And these new life projects which emerge in midlife, which focus on building new skills. A lot of people convert, they might through faith-based practices. They go through religious conversion abroad. So there's many rich kind of life projects which emerge in this space, which that narrative of only precarity might obscure, but it's still very much there and shaping that uncertainty. So I think there's both that exhaustion and attempts to find joy.
I really like the idea of life projects. So, you're in like many different side quests. You're not just here to, figure out care for the family, the whole family who was hired you, or thinking about caring for your family back home, which is why, in my understanding, lots of folks come on to take on these precarious contracts. So this idea of life projects, side quests, is a very nourishing way to think about their lives in wholeness rather than this singular focus. Inba.
Thinking about generative ambivalence among like the community members, like our co-researchers. Precarity has become a condition of life that they do not necessarily see a complete way apart from it. It has become part of their ways of like functioning. And yet there is this sense that this is just what it is. And it's nothing, it's not too, they're not too depressed about it that they're unable to move forward. They're not too joyful and hopeful about the future, that they're able to just withstand this without feelings of like negative emotions. So they hold both of this in the same space. And it's also something that we see daily during the fieldwork. Like we would have a session where we would have quite a bit of experience shared about abuse or emotional distress. And we would have our collective just crying, and then we'd go out for tea or like have snacks, and we're laughing and talking about little things. Oh, like I like this, I like almonds, but I don't get to buy almonds. So this is an almond cake, and they're sharing it with each other. And they would come to me and say, oh, you should try this food out there, that's really good. Or you should try this snack. And so the conversations were continually oscillating between emotions, and it was somehow, I guess, what captured the complexity of their lives. And in another sense, like we were having, for an example, like we were having this collective preliminary data analysis review. So we first conduct the thematic analysis. We have our initial codes, basic codes, and we have the basic themes. And then we go into this fieldwork and we teach them this process. So how do we go from a basic code to a basic theme? And we gave out a bunch of codes, like 100 codes, to this split into groups, and for them to think about basic themes. And they constructed their own basic themes. And we match it with ours, and we think about what needs changes, whether our themes are adequate in expressing their complex emotions and their representations of their experience. And like an example that really stood out to me was this one basic theme that I had built at the time, that was family relations impact personal life and freedoms. And I was coming from this point of view because I was also seeing a lot of resonances between instances of abuse within family, be it husbands or mother-in-laws or neglect of children. And so, and in English, this is fine because impact has both positive and negative connotations. But our fieldwork is carried out in Tamil, by the way. So when I translated it in Tamil, for the word impact, I used padipu, which has a more negative connotation. And this might be influenced by my reading of all this like abusive relationships that they have had in their life. And one of the collective members pointed it out to me, where they said, you can't just separate out instances of violence within our family, but there's also a larger backdrop of care and relations. And we live for our family, and we find resilience and support in our family. So we then had to collectively think about what would be the word that can hold both the connotations, the positive and the negative connotations. And we decided on nirnaipadu, which is influencing in Tamil. So although in the academic knowledge production, our work is in English, and that's what people would access, it was also very important to us that even in Tamil, we represent their experiences as they want it to be represented. And that's one of those spaces where I found generative ambivalence in how we constructed the findings.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Inba, because also when we think about how we translated precarity into Tamil, so, it's already quite an abstract concept in English, and then we are doing our project in 3 languages, basically in Malay and in Tamil and in English, and all our consent forms and ethics, everything is written in these 3 languages. And so how do we actually talk about precarity, which is already difficult to talk about in English, in Tamil? And because of this theoretical approach that we had, thinking about generative ambivalence, thinking about precarity as not just a hopeful place or a hopeless place, it could be neither or, it could be both. And in Tamil, there's a word called nilai illame, which is like instability. And that could be a more direct translation of precarity, but we decided to go with this, hopeless, hopeful, generative ambivalence. And we thought about nilayatra sandarpangal. And nilayatra sandarpangal literally means unstable opportunities. To think about the positive elements that could come out of this instability. And then explain to our collective, this is where we were coming from and why we approached it in this way, then also gave us feedback as to whether this theorization resonated with them. And this is what we are talking about, the decolonial principle of co-constructing knowledge and participatory relational engagement in action. So some things were not an oversight, but very much embedded into the theoretical, but as well as the methodological approach. I'm mindful of time, so maybe we get to the last question. So we have good 25 minutes for questions. Solidarity is something that we saw as threads throughout both our projects. And in trying to think about the practical elements of solidarity, so how did solidarity manifest and what are these implications for policy? I think that would be a good question to start off.
Yeah. So solidarity in my research context emerged really on a smaller scale. So among the women themselves, a lot of grassroots initiatives to think about the future. Then they would have sort of mentorship schemes within these programs, and general sort of building those communities over many years because they've been in Singapore for such a long time. So solidarity was expressed in terms of this mutual help and in more of this horizontal way. Of course, there were also tensions between these communities, but by and large, that was the scale at which I saw experiences or examples of solidarity. But then a lot of these questions have very real policy implications. And there was a disconnect, I think, or there is a disconnect between sort of what you see on the ground. And the policies which are still dominant across many places in Southeast Asia, but also the Gulf states, through these temporary labor migration regimes, which are very instrumentally, transactional and economic in nature, and they are imagined really, they take as the main figure a young, fit, productive working body. And there is little imagination of the body aging or the body in the context of the life course and what happens when they are no longer productive, contributing economically to, as workers in the host countries. And so neither the places where they work offer social protection for migrant workers who are aging. Countries of origin, it's quite varied. So for example, the Philippines has some schemes for sort of transnational social protection, but they aren't really sufficient to kind of sustain somebody's livelihood in retirement. And I think what's happened is that there is now a shift to a more kind of neoliberal approach to this. So some of the programs that exist in the Philippines and also the NGOs in Singapore, which are preparing migrant women for their futures, are very much about, financial literacy and financial education and entrepreneurship. And a lot of the women I did my research with were very invested in these programs, and they liked this idea of being their own boss, of being rich, not working for an oppressive employer anymore. But in reality, these are very risky, and a lot of the the kinds of investments that they encourage are quite risky. And the narrative essentially is that you are responsible for your own failures or successes in your own future, right? So it kind of goes back very much to the individual. So I still find that in terms of policy, there is, it's not really thought of in a kind of holistic way. There are kind of things here and there that are emerging, but ultimately they are not working to support workers who are retiring or returning to their countries.
Yeah.
With like financial security.
And what about disability? So if, it's not to say that aging is only synonymous with disability,
of course.
but you do see an increasing trend.
And so disability, also chronic health conditions. So these are also factors which can really be crisis moments, which break that cycle of earning and sending money home to your family and leaving people in very precarious situations because insurances are not necessarily going to cover.
Right.
So again, in the Philippines, there are schemes which also protect against disability. So it's this social security scheme. But in some other, those coming from India or Sri Lanka, there isn't the same level of state support. And certainly there are many people who kind of fall through the gaps or the cracks
that were intentionally created.
And whatever little savings might have emerged from years of working can very quickly disappear if somebody receives a diagnosis or is not able to work. So this is a challenge.
How about in the project Escape from Solidarity?
I just had a pause in my thoughts, ambivalence, refusal. Okay, so one of the activities that we conducted was for the community researchers to identify their own problems and come up with their own solutions. So we're like, okay, so you say that right now your problem is making income and finding side hustles. So what training could we offer you, or what skills could we develop in order for you to solve this problem that you have in your life? And they suggested that they wanted business skills and financial literacy training. But for us to come to this conclusion that business skills and financial literacy training, we had to have like debates and advocate for skills, because there were people who wanted to learn Mandarin, for instance, because they think that would give them access to different kinds of business. There were people who wanted to take parenting courses so they could be better parents to their disabled children. There were others who were suggesting things like baking or sewing, like skills that we can all attain together. But this collective is like 47 people. So how do we then negotiate and come to a consensus? So they also had to advocate for like when they were presenting the skills that they asked, they spoke about not just individual benefit, but how will this benefit the collective? And then talking as a whole, then they came to this consensus. So they were able to build some level of in-group solidarity, and they had built enough trust within each other, not just in the context of research, where they can then speak openly about their experiences and their private lives, especially things that relate to domestic violence, which is considered a stigma in the community to speak about. So they've all had this shared moment where they were there for each other and they were each other's support network. And they started meeting outside of the research setting as well, be like, let's go get a cup of coffee once a week, just so we have that 1 hour to ourselves, since we're learning about coloniality of time. So let's have time for ourselves. But at the same time, there was this cognitive dissonance or ambivalence. There were also these moments where we might hear anti-migrant rhetoric in the community, because they talk so much about their struggles with poverty and so on. And they also, I guess, in some ways come to the conclusion that migrant workers are taking over our jobs. And that is why our job is so precarious. Our job contracts are so precarious because they're so easily replaceable by migrant workers from Bangladesh or migrant workers from Myanmar, Rohingya community. And then you hear the same kind of like colonial rhetoric of, I will start a business and hire cheap labor and exploit their labor in order to make my success and make my break in this cycle of poverty. So I guess it is also because we've only been able to interact with them for 16 months. And we did have a lot of activities that was trying to develop like a more global decolonial consciousness. We talked about other plantation communities, sugarcane plantations, and tea plantations in other parts of the world, in order for them to understand that their situation is not unique to just Malaysian Indians, but that there are other migrant communities under the indentured servitude system that have continued to experience the same kind of precarity and poverty. But there were also this tension of like slipping between, oh, so many people have suffered the way we do, and oh, these people are taking over our jobs. So it has been a bit of a struggle in that sense to extend the solidarity outwards.
I think what's interesting is this concept of coloniality, which steps out of colonization as being this discrete period, right? That we are still living within coloniality. Some scholars talk about it as we are breathing coloniality, so entrenched in our everyday life. And so whilst you can observe similarities between your condition and other indentured laborers who came from South India, perhaps to South Africa, for example, because one of the other projects that Inba and I are working on is looking at folks in South Africa and the similarities that they are experiencing with folks in Malaysia. And we shared this with our collective in this project, and they were interested to see the themes and the strands that were connecting them. Folks in South Africa had gone over to work on sugarcane plantations, and here they had gone to work on rubber plantations. And so they could make these references. But then when they think about the new wave of Bangladeshi workers who are working on plantations, so less Indians are now working on plantations at the moment, they are thinking of how they could exploit their labor in the same way that they were exploited. And that's this entrenchment of coloniality, the same vicious system within which we are working and operating, which is not just material, but also psychological. We need to think about how that is informing the way that we engage with other people and with ourselves. And I think that's a good space to stop and open for questions online as well as in the floor, if there are any.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. So I will be curating the questions online, but the floor is open, and if you're comfortable with that, Geeta, I will let you manage the floor, and I will let you know if there are online questions.
Thank you. Is everyone? Do we have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about unstable opportunity. And it was very clear from the Malaysian project, for example, what the instabilities are. But can you delve more into the opportunity side? Right? How did your interlocutors see themselves? What material, psychological, or whatever realities are they going through that makes them think that they are precarious rather than simply impoverished, for example? Right? So what are the positives, so to speak? And then for the entire panel, a particular difficulty in working with ethnography or with interlocutors is very difficult to impart both the timeline of academic life, right? And also the uselessness of it in their lives, right? You know, trying to explain to them that maybe the only output that we'll have at the end of this is a publication in a journal somewhere, right? So was that a particular problem with your projects, especially, for example, when there are demands that your own engagement with them produce something more concrete for their own lives, right? So how do we deal with that particular problem as researchers, as ethnographers, or in general? Right?
Great questions. I didn't get your name, sorry.
Miguel, I'm from the Philippines.
Nice to meet you, Miguel. So the positivity or the opportunities question, it manifests in different ways. You know, you have collective members who have lost jobs elsewhere, for example, but they still have, you know, children to feed and to school and to take care of. And one collective member just comes to my mind, where she started working as a Grab driver. So, you know, this hire vehicle, like, you know, equivalent, we have them in the UK, like Uber. And she, with this photo voice method, we had invited everyone to give 5 photographs which represent precarity for them. And we had given some examples. You know, for example, if you're walking past a longkang or a, you know, what's a longkang in English? Drain. And, you know, it's filled with mud and you have to walk past this every day and you think like, why don't they just fix this longkang, you know? But it's there, and this is an example of precarity because no one is coming to our neighborhood to fix the longkang. And so we gave this kind of examples, and what came was quite fascinating. In this collective member who had this vehicle, she put this picture of a cat, you know, this cat which, like, you know, does this thing. Yeah. And she said, every time I look at that cat, I get very happy. Because the cat reminds me to be in the moment. And yes, I'm driving this vehicle and it's tough and I'm thinking about my children. But when I look at that cat, I'm reminding myself why I'm doing this. I'm showing this strength for myself and for my children. And, you know, a critique could be, oh, you know, just because you're in poverty doesn't mean you need to, you know, lift yourself up out of this, right? But she didn't see that as like, oh, a despondent state. She was like, oh, there's something else that I can do in this moment, a skill that I can develop in this moment that helps put food on the table. And so she saw it as an opportunity presenting itself. And we have another example of a collective member who was a security guard in a condominium. And very similar theme of making the best of this. If they did not have this situation, they would not be working as a security guard. They would not have all of these friends that they would have met otherwise. Their social life would have been very different. Another collective member who is a, you know, a parking attendant, you know, lifting up the barrier each time. And she was reflecting how, you know, these barriers are now automated and no longer she's in this little cubicle where she's been working for the last 15 years of her life. The organization, the company has gotten rid of all these cubicles and made them automatic. And she's, you know, she said how difficult it was to work so many hours, you know, lifting this thing up and closing. But in that same breath, she said, I really miss it because that gave me all that friendship and I know everybody there. And so you have to hold these things hand in hand. Yes, there was a lot of pain and there was a lot of strife and they're trying to lift themselves out of these impoverished conditions. But there's also this understanding that, yeah, that's where the generative ambivalence comes in. You know, I need to make this work. And where are the joyful moments? And we were talking about this last night at dinner as well. There wasn't this conversation around happiness as this idealized state to achieve, but rather where can we find joy in what we are doing? And that is a form of resistance that is taking place. And when we put all the collective stories together, there is this collective resilience, this idea of community relations as being the way to get themselves through the situation. And so we have to hold both of these states or 3 of these states at the same time, which is quite difficult as a researcher to do because you want to have this one story, oh, everything is shit, you know, we need to do something good. Oops. I'm sorry for that one. But, you know, but it's not. The human condition is so diverse and complex, and we can hold that complexity as researchers. We just have to be able to tell the story better. And some methods allow us to tell that story better than other methods. Did you want to add something?
I think that pretty much encompassed. But yeah, so when we're talking about opportunities, like one of the discussions that we were having also surprisingly was that some of them were saying it's good that I work part-time jobs so I can take on opportunities like this, because otherwise I will not be able to take like 6 days off and join fieldwork. And they're trying to find those little moments of like connections and meaning in the things that they do. And a lot of the times we also hear stories like, I actually wasn't doing too bad in life when I was married, but I divorced my spouse for this and this reasons. And now that has, put me in a position where in impoverished conditions. And yet, like, I would choose this life over that. So they do find opportunities even in spite of precarity, and sometimes also because of precarity.
Maybe I'll pick up the next question. Yeah, on kind of what the use of academic practice and ethnography. It's always tricky, I think, when you go in and deal with issues which have very real life policy implications, right? But I think as an ethnographer, I'm always careful to not promise that I'm going to change something for them. That's just being transparent about the limits of what I can do and what this is about. But I also feel there is something about being able to tell your story with time and, on an ongoing basis where somebody is listening, which is not always something that they have the opportunity to do, especially with these more extractivist, like survey kind of, how long have you been here? Are you happy at work? This kind of thing. So there's different methods or ways of engaging. That's one thing. And then I think the other thing is we, as much as, however far it gets, I don't know, but we try a little bit in the outputs that we have to go beyond just academic texts. So one example was I left a few flyers there, but we worked with an illustrator to draw some of the stories and to tell the story and to talk about the research in a more accessible way, so that it could be, sent to people who might be able to do something if they have the information available, not behind a paywall of a journal where they have to read 12 pages, but a little bit more kind of, okay, this is what, and here and there in some of our academic publications, we might also try to put forward some policy recommendations, whether it gets to the people who are making these policies, maybe not, but there are also chances to, go to events. For example, the Department of Migrant Workers in the Philippines is quite open to having researchers present their work. And so there have been opportunities there to also speak directly to policymakers on some of the findings that we.
Thank you.
To pick up the
Yeah, so we also have like non-academic dissemination using arts-based methods. So we've also hired illustrators and website designer to then, we have a website as well, escapeurmi.com, which is in 3 languages, Tamil, Malay, and English, so as to make it accessible, not just for the English-speaking community, but to our very own collective members who are reading about their stories in Tamil. But I think another big focus that we had was how do we give them what they are asking for, because they are asking for a specific kind of empowerment. They know what they need. So we just need to make space for it. So when they come to us and they say, I think I want to start a small business, and for that I need business skills. And then we go and find a trainer who is also part of the community, who understands the nuances and can speak in Tamil and Malay and break down to them, okay, this is how you get a small business license. These are the regulations that are in place. This is how taxation works. This is how you find investors. This is how you do marketing. And then we have a financial literacy trainer who comes in and talks about how do you clear your debts if you ever have to go to the government and sort these things out. How do you plan for insurances? So we have very practical tips from these external trainers with specialized knowledge and skills that we do not have. But we also have like practical on the ground, how to approach not policy, but programs like welfare and aid programs that they are usually engaging with. We had someone who was working for APPG MSDG, all
All-Party Parliamentary Group for Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes. And Dr. Suen, who came in and told them, so this is how policy works. It comes from the nation level to the state level to your district level. Here's how you apply for programs. These are the documents that you may need. But also, if you were to design a program, what would it look like? And what would be the challenges you will face? And then role play what this looks like with a gatekeeper interaction. If you have to go and speak to an elected representative to present this, what would you do? How would you start this conversation? What are the practical tips to start your own programs? So I think this kind of skills building will last beyond the life cycle of this project, and it's something that they can then take on and build within their immediate community.
Yeah, I mean, this was planned at the start. The idea that we were guided by was psychosocial accompaniment. This idea that we are not there to create the strategies or the solutions for you, but we are here to guide you and to support you. And we are here to, like, do tap on us, tell us what we can support you with, but you are the creators and the leaders of your own vision. And so this decolonial principle of psychosocial accompaniment was really helping us in designing the entire project. Petra, maybe you have questions.
We've got one question online. Would you like me to read it for you?
I'll try. I'm Mary Sheikh, and also select to all speakers. How would a reverse racism lens add to the ambivalent views of these women? How would a reverse racism?
There's such a thing as reverse racism.
Should we put that, the comedian? There's an Australian comedian who talks about reverse racism much more beautifully than I probably will. I'll try to find that. I don't know how that would apply to our collective. I'm not sure, to be honest. Do you have a response?
Have to think about that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Racism is on a power structure, right?
Yeah.
You need to be able to have a specific power over a community. So I'm guessing this is about the migration thing, probably. Is it like racism towards Bangladeshi migrants and whatnot?
But that's not reverse racism.
But it's not reverse, it's racism.
Yeah.
And there's also there's not enough of a power structure to actually enact any kind of harm to the community, because this community is not empowered to do that either. So I would say there's a lot of prejudice, but I'm not sure whether
reverse racism. Yeah, I don't agree with this concept. So that's my honest answer. Think about racism as a system of power. Racism comes from colonial racial capitalism, this idea of, you know, creating a hierarchy of deservedness between people based on color and geographical location. And so because it's a system of power, then we are thinking about where does the power lie in these communities that we are working with. And I think for aging domestic workers from Philippines or Sri Lanka or India, there's not much power that they actually have to enact any change state-wise or institutionally in Singapore. And there are several Indian representatives in Malaysian governments, but they cannot be claimed to be holding, you know, this kind of regulatory power. It is a Bumiputra country, Bumiputra sons of the soil, and so there is a Malay hegemony in Malaysia. So reverse racism doesn't quite fit as a concept to understand the levels of prejudice or discrimination that is taking place and that we are talking about when Indian women are enacting these prejudicial views that they have on Bangladeshi migrant workers or Rohingya refugees, for example. What's interesting to contextualize this is that these women seem to be mimicking the trends that other communities in Malaysia are also enacting on the same Rohingya communities. So it's quite fascinating to see how there is a general consensus that the Palestinian genocide is wrong, and there's a lot of support for that whilst at the same time, when you're thinking about Rohingya refugees who are just, a boat ride away, and the same level of support is not given. So this is the context within which it's operating in Malaysia. And I think that's very important to understand, that even our point being that even marginalized communities are not inoculated from these hegemonic views on who deserves support, who deserves access to resources, and who deserves dignity. Just because you're marginalized doesn't mean that you suddenly, have this perspective that everyone is deserving of freedom, deserving of liberation. That would be my answer. Maybe one more question here. Yeah.
Thank you. Really insightful panel discussion. I'm talking on behalf of students here now and thinking more practicalities of conducting research that is generative and non-extractive. As students, be it undergrad, masters, postgrad, we are not privy, we don't necessarily have access to the time and the funding in order to be able to create these generative spaces, because they usually take time and money. So would you have, or do you have any tips, advice for us to be able to go in? Because you mentioned how there is a saturation in migrant worker research, and people are very much in and out, quite extractive. I'm assuming with the Escape Rooming projects as well, that's quite similar. So what can we do as students and career researchers to be able to go into these spaces and create generative, collaborative work that is non-exploitative, non-extractive? Yeah.
I mean, I think the example I gave was ethnography, which I think is quite difficult for students. Maybe over a summer that could be possible. And as a student, I did that myself. So I had these only 2 months at the time. And it's only later on that you start to reflect on whether or not this is the right way to go about it. But I actually then turned to you because I think the kit, the decolonial guide you created, offers many activities that could be done in a relatively short period of time as well. Something like that. I could imagine fitting sort of student-oriented work.
Yeah, I think scaling down a lot of these things. So, I mean, like the kit offers, particular activities that you can put together, but also understanding that this work is going to take a lot of time. So if you decide to, if you're doing a master's and then you decide, okay, I only have 3 months to collect my data, then you have to factor in, okay, how many activities are you going to do within this 3 months and how much engagement are you going to have? Because you start off with the approach that I am going to have this engagement, I am going to co-construct this knowledge. But also as students, you understand that there are limitations. Your PhD is your PhD, and you have funder regulations. At the end of the day, you have to produce your PhD thesis. And so, this co-construction of knowledge or collective participation is always on a spectrum. So you scale up or you scale down. And at the very end, you sort of like, this is the paradigm within which I'm operating. How much can I have input in this process? And I think it is tricky, but if you understand that it's not an all or nothing approach, but rather, how much can I do within this time frame, and be very open about this with your collective and say, this is the, at the end of 3 months, I have to produce my MSc dissertation. How much can we work together within this period? But also this idea of the psychosocial accompaniment, or there is another term, pase duluran, which is in Indonesian, which is this idea that you don't let go of your collective after the time period that data is collected. Which is difficult if you have like funder regulations, because ethics, like your ethics approval finishes at a particular time and they're not supposed to have this contact. But maybe one way to do that is embed it into our ethical approval, to say that this is a community that I'm working with. I'm not going to collect any data after this, but I'm offering myself as a point of contact if they need anything. Obviously thinking about our own, capacities as well, our own mental health, our own caring responsibilities and so on. But promise only what you know that is aligned with this decolonial principle and aligned with what you can provide. And I think when you're operating from this authentic space, people will respond to that. Just don't overpromise or, you know, say, I'm going to create an entire exhibition with all of you in 1 year and then like, oops, I got no funding and I can't do this. It's something which is negotiated between you and the collective. I think that would be my approach to this. I think we're bang on time.
Before I forget, you wanted to put the QR code up?
Yes, it's up. The slides have gone off.
Tell me if it feels like.
Yeah. I would like to thank you, Petra. Thank you for having us, and thank you so much for coming. And this is the QR code for the toolkit. It's on Open Science Framework, so it will get you onto the OSF platform. You can just download it for free. And Mega and I and Inba, we have some postcards and pamphlets on there. The Escape Urmi digital exhibition, which is what Inba talked about, www.escapeurmi.com, is a accessible dissemination of our research, our analysis. It's there. There are postcards, and Mega also has some policy pamphlets and artist illustrations from a project. Please feel free to help yourself to them. And thank you for being a wonderful audience and host.